Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi shir.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Brachos Daf Yud Beis. We're 8 lines from the top. Says the Gemara V'Koirin Aseres Hadibros. This is referring to the Mishmar Dikoyahanim at the onset of their day of service of their Yom Avodah. In the beginning of their Avodah, they would recite Aseres Hadibros. They would go on to say Shema, V'Hayom Shemaya, V'Yomer. Why was it important for them to say the Aseres Hadibros, the 10 Commandments, in conjunction with Kriyas Shema? So the Rishonim explain, Rav Saadia Gaon actually discovered that within the Aseres Hadibros is merumas, is hinted all of the commandments, all the Taryag mitzvahs HaTorah, and therefore it's very fitting for them to recite Aseres Hadibros next to Kriyas Shema, which certainly contains this aspect as well, the Kabbalas Oil Mitzvah. It's one who accepts upon himself, who commits himself to do Hashem's commandments. Continuing the Gemara, Emes v'Yatziv, they said the bracha following Krishma of Emes v'Yatziv, Va'avoida, the bracha of Avoida, Ritzeh Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem, you should accept willingly our tefillos, our avoida, our service, and finally, Ubrichas Kohanim, the psukim of Yorecha Hashem V'Yishmerecha, etc., which are contained in Brichas Kohanim. Continues the Gemara, Omar Rav Yehuda Mashmuel, Af Bigvulin, Bikshu Likros Kain. Even in the provinces outside of the Beis Hamikdash, they wished to enact, they wanted to be masakin, this takana, this practice, that one should recite the Aseres Hadibros in conjunction with Kriyas Shema, Ella, but Shekvar Vitlum, they needed to abolish it, on account of the arguments of the heretics who would use this practice, this custom, as a basis for their views that the entire Torah is false. The only thing that would be true is the Aseres Hadibros, since we heard it directly from Hashem. This way they would mislead the Amei Haaretz, the unlearned people, and on account of these arguments, the Chachamim need to abolish this practice. Tanya Nami Hachi, we learn a Brisa which states a similar thing. Rabbi Nosson Omer, Bigvulin, Bikshu Likros Kain, they wanted to enact this takana in the provinces El Shekvar Bitlum. They needed to abolish it with Metaroimus Aminin on account of the arguments coming from the Kaifrim. Rabba Bar Chana Savar, he wanted to Limikbi'inu B'Sura, he wanted to enact this practice in the town of Surah. Rav Chizda, no, Kvar Bitlum, Metaroimus Aminin, you may not do so. Ameimer Savar Limikbinu Ben Arda. Ameimer wanted to enact this minhag in the town of Arda. A similar response came forth from Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi, Kvar Bitlum, Mipetaroimes Haminin. We are not meant to recite the Aseres Hadibros in conjunction with Kriyas Shema. Continues the Gemara. Ube Shabbos, Muisifen Bracha Achas, Lemishmar Hayotze. On Shabbos there was an additional bracha for the outgoing group of Kohanim who had already finished their line of duty in the Beis Hamikdash. Says the Gemara, my bracha achas, what was contained in this blessing? Amar Chelboy, Mishmar Hayotze, the outgoing Mishmar, the group of Kohanim that already finished their duty in the Beis Hamikdash. Omer, they would direct a bracha Lemishmar Nichnas, to the incoming group of Kohanim, and they would say as follows: Misha Shikein es Shmoi Babayis Hazeh, Hashem who has rested His name upon this, in this house, in this Beis Hamikdash, who He will yashki b'nechem, He should rest upon you. Ava v'achva, love and brotherhood, v'shalom v'reus, peace and friendship. Says the Gemara, Makam she'omer laharach, it's referring back to the Mishnah, where the Mishnah has told us that there are many classifications of brachos. Some are long, some are brief, some contain a conclusion of Baruch Ata Hashem, some don't. Says the Gemara, let's say, if somebody makes a bracha and errors, he makes a mistake, the first part of the bracha he does improperly, and the second part, the chasima, was done properly, or vice versa. Which one is determinant? Which one is the main kaiveya? Will determine the nature of the bracha. Let's see the Gemara. Pshita, this would be simple. The following case would be simple. If a person is holding a cup which contains wine, and of course on wine we make Borei Pri Hagofen, he was holding a cup of chamra biyodei, because savar, and he erroneously thought the shichrahu, that it contains beer, which requires a different bracha of shakol niya b'dvarei. Upasach mevarach, he began to make a bracha adata de shichra. He said Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, with the intention to complete a shahakol on the beer which he thought he was holding. V'siyam b'dechamra, and then he noticed that it was wine, and he concluded the bracha properly. Borei Pri Hagofen. Yatsa, in that case, although the opening part of the bracha, the first section of Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam was recited with the intention to conclude it with a shahakol, nevertheless, it will count and it will be a proper bracha when combined with the conclusion of Hagafen. Why? Says the Gemara, Di Nami. Im Omar Shakol Nia B'dvar, if he would even have concluded the way he had originally intended to, he would have carried out his intention, he would have finished with the Shahakol. That too would have been okay, since if one recites a Shahakol on anything, he has fulfilled his obligation. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Al Kulam, on any food, Im Omar Shakol Nia B'dvar Yatza. So in this case, even though he erred, he intended to make a Hagafen, he intended to make a Shahakol, but since it was a Shahakol which can be applied to anything, therefore we're not concerned with the fact that he had the wrong intention in the beginning of the bracha, and he has fulfilled, and he's considered to have said a proper bracha, and he may drink the wine. Continues the Gemara. What's going to happen in the following case? Ella, however, in the following case, here we have a shaila. Here we have a inquiry. Perhaps he was holding a cup of containing beer, which requires a shahakol. Because he figured it was wine. And he began his bracha with that intention. Pasach u'baruch adata dechamra. He began to say the bracha baruch ata Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam with the intention of making hagafen. However, then in the midway, he noticed that indeed it was beer. V'siyem b'deshichra. And he concluded the bracha properly with a shahakol nia b'dvari. So now we have a problem. The first part of the bracha was said with the kavana, with the machshava, with the intention of making a hagafen, which cannot count, which cannot be applied to beer. But the ending of the bracha, the chasima of the bracha, was done properly. It was done with a shahakol. So the question is, what do we follow? What determines the nature of the bracha? My baser ikka bracha azlina. Do we follow the initial part of the bracha, the first part of the bracha, which was done improperly? Oi basar chasima azlina. Do we view the chasima, the conclusion of the bracha, as being the primary part of the bracha, and we follow accordingly? And in this case, he will have said a proper bracha since he concluded with the shahakol nia b'dvarai, which was the proper word. Tashma, come and listen. We have a brisa which describes a similar shaila. Shachris, in the morning tefillah, pasach b'yitziror. He began the Brichas Krishma by saying Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam with the intention of saying Yetzirar, the proper bracha required for Krishma Shal Shachris. However, V'siyim b'marav aravim, then after Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam, he continued to say Ma'av aravim b'chachma, which is the nusach of Krishma Shal Arvis. Lo Yotza, certainly in that case, he has not fulfilled his obligation since he concluded with the wrong nusach, with the words which were meant for Krishma Shal Arvis and not for the Brichas Krishma Shal Shachris. However, in the reverse case, Pasach b'marav aravim, he began the Brichas Krishma Shal Shachris. He began to say Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam with the intention of following through with Marav aravim, with the bracha which was appropriate for evening. However, he never carried that out. V'siyam b'yitzir. Once he reached Elokeinu melech ha'olam, he realized, hey, it's morning, and he continued on with the proper word, the proper terminology of yitzir. So then, Yatza, he indeed is Yaitse, he has fulfilled his obligation. Continues the brisa. What about in the evening? Arvis, if it was evening time, and he started Pasach, he opened with Marav aravim. He opened the bracha, Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam, with the intention of continuing with Marav aravim, properly saying the bracha of Krishma Shal Arvis. V'siyam, however, when he got to the point of Melech ha'olam, he concluded wrongly. He concluded erroneously with the Yitzir, with the words which were meant for Krishma Shal Shachris. Lo Yatza, he has not fulfilled his obligation. However, in the reverse, Pasach b'yitzir, if he began, this is again by Krishma Shal Arvis, he began the bracha Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam with the intention of concluding b'yitzir. He thought it was morning, he thought he meant to say yitzir, but then in the midway, he realized, hey, it's evening, v'siyim b'marav aravim, and he concluded properly with the words marav aravim, Yatza, he is Yaitse, he has fulfilled his obligation. Klali shadavar, the general rule is, hakal ha'ilech achar chisum, we always follow what was said in the conclusion. The chisum, the conclusion, is what determines the nature and quality of the bracha. So again, the brisa mentioned 4 cases, and ended with a rule that in the case where he concludes properly, even if the initial part of the bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam was said with the wrong intention. He had a kavanah, he had intended to conclude the bracha in the wrong manner. However, since he actually concludes it properly, that is what determines, that is what's kiveya, and if he concludes it properly, regardless of how he began, with what intentions he had began the bracha is a proper bracha. So we see from here that the chisum, the ending, the conclusion of the bracha is what determines the bracha. Similarly, in our previous case with the wine and the beer, it would seem that it all depends on how he concludes the bracha. Even if he begins with the wrong intention, he begins with Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam with the intention to say Hagafen, but really he's holding a cup of beer and he concludes with Shahakol, although the beginning of the bracha was inappropriate since a Hagafen can never work for a Shahakol, for a beer. Nevertheless, since he concluded properly with a Shahakol, he is Yotze. Says the Gemara, no, we can't bring any raya, we can't infer regarding the wine and the beer from this brisa which discusses the Birchas Krishma. Why? Says the Gemara, there's a big difference. Shani Hasam, the case over there is very different. The Ka'amar Baruch Yotzei Ma'oros. Since the Chasima over there involves a full-fledged conclusion of Baruch Atah Hashem Yotzei Ma'oros, that is considered to be a bona fide Chasima, which certainly the bracha can be determined according to that Chasima. And since he concludes with a Baruch Atah Hashem Yotzei Ma'oros, this is referring to the incident where he made a mistake regarding Krishma Shel Shachris. Similarly, in the case of Krishma Shel Aris, that he began thinking that it's morning, he began with the intention, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, the intention to continue saying Yotzer, but since he concludes the Baruch Atah Hashem Marav Arovim, that is a very strong, significant conclusion, and therefore, that indeed determines, and that is Kaveya. However, in the case of a Birchas Ha'oichlan, Ha'bichas Ha'nenen, which is merely a short bracha, which doesn't really have a full-fledged conclusion, it doesn't have a Baruch Atah Hashem at the end, we're merely taking a short bracha of Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, stopping there and considering that to be the psicha, and after that, Boyer Priya Gofen to be considered to be the Chasima. That is not the case. That type of Chasima is not significant enough to have us determine the bracha accordingly. Says the Gemara, this assertion that you're making, that Baruch Atah Hashem Yotzei Ma'oros is so significant, and therefore the bracha is determined, is ruled accordingly, that only works according to Rav, who says that a bracha merely needs to contain the Shem Hashem. Hanichal Rav de Omar Kol bracha she'ein ba haskoras Hashem in a bracha. Rav holds there's a machlekes in Rav and Rabbi Yochanan what constitutes a proper bracha. According to Rav, you need to mention Hashem's name. According to Rabbi Yochanan, you need to add also Melech Haolam, Hashem is the king of the world. So according to Rav, certainly Baruch Atah Hashem Yotzei Ma'oros has a significance, is considered to be a full-fledged chasima. It's as though it's a bracha on its own since it contains the Shem Hashem, Baruch Atah Hashem Yotzei Ma'oros. So that works fine. Shafir, that will be a nice conclusion to this question, meaning that Baruch Atah Hashem certainly is considered to be a chasima, and we determine the bracha accordingly. Elul Rabbi Yochanan, however, according to the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan, the Omar called bracha she'ein bo malchus ein a bracha. A bracha needs to contain, aside from the Shem Hashem, it also needs to describe Hashem's kingdom, Hashem's kingship over the world. And in this case of Baruch Atah Hashem Yotzei Ma'oros, there's no mention of Melech there. So Ma'ikol Meimar, that can't be considered to be a significant conclusion. It can't carry the full weight of a bracha, and therefore, in this case, where he erroneously began with the intention of saying the wrong bracha, just because he concludes with Baruch Atah Hashem Yotzei Ma'oros, that chasima cannot determine the bracha completely, and therefore we have a conflict between the beginning of the bracha and the end of the bracha. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, we'll have to explain the reason for the halacha of the brisa that we follow the chasima with a different explanation. Ella, it must be that the reason why, in the aforementioned case where he began, it was the morning and he began Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam with the intention to conclude Marav Arovim, and then he went ahead and actually concluded properly with Yotzei Ma'oros. Why does that work? Why is that considered to be a proper Birchas HaShachar? Says the Gemara, we have another reason for that. Elo kiven the Amar Rabba Barula K'dei lahaskir midas yom b'layla. Why do we mention day and night? We mentioned that during the Brachos of Krishma Shel Shachris, and as well during the Brachos Krishma Shel Aris. In both times we mention both day and night. Why is that so? As mentioned in yesterday's daf, we want to mention both characteristics of day and night to tell us, to underline, to express that Hashem, who is the one God who created everything, all of creation, day and night, He controls all aspects of this world. Therefore, we mention we mention the characteristic of Yom even at night, and Umidas Laila b'Yom, we mention the midah, the characteristic of a Laila even by day. So therefore, if that's the case, that when one begins reciting Krishna Shel Shacharis, he really has the intention of mentioning both night and day. Similarly, when one begins reciting Krishna, the Brachos Krishna Shel Aris, his kavanah is he intends to mention day and night as well. So therefore, even in the case where it was Krishna Shel Shacharis, and he erroneously thought it was Krishna Shel Aris, and he began to say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, with the kavanah, with the machshava, with the intention to conclude with Marav Aravim B'Chachma, which is the Brachos Krishna Shel Aris. But even in that bracha, he would have mentioned Yom, since we always mention both day and night by both sets of brachas, by Krishna Shel Aris and Krishna Shel Aris. So therefore, his original intention really was also to include somewhat of an aspect of Yom. So therefore, it's not considered to be a complete error, and we reckon with the Tchilas HaBracha as well as the Seif HaBracha, and it is not considered to be an erroneous haschala, since he had an intention to include Yom there as well. Let's see inside. Since Rabbi Rula teaches us that one is meant to mention day and night together, Ki ka'amar a bracha u'malchus mi'ikara, when he began his bracha with the intention of concluding with Marav Aravim, it was morning, he was meant to say Yoitzer, and he had the intention of saying Marav Aravim. Still, since in his mind he was going to say Atar Vayu Kamar, he was going to mention both of them, even within Marav Aravim. He thought he was meant to say the Brachos Marav Aravim. But even in the Brachos Marav Aravim, we mentioned day, we mentioned the characteristic of Yom, so his kavanah was to speak about Yom. Therefore, it counts towards Krishma Shel Shacharis. So in conclusion, the Gemara explains to us that when one makes a mistake, he erroneously begins with the wrong bracha, whether it's by Krishma Shel Shacharis, when he has the intention of concluding with Marav Aravim, he begins Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam with the kavanah to continue to carry out Marav Aravim, but he goes ahead and concludes. He realized that it's morning, and he concludes with Yetzer. So the chasima was done properly. What about the psicha? What about the opening part, the first portion of the bracha? Says the Gemara, there as well, since even had he carried out his intention to say the bracha Marav Aravim, he still would have had included the aspect of Yom. Therefore, the entire bracha is considered a proper Brachos HaShachar and is applied to the Brachos Krishma, and he is Yotzei Brachos Krishma. But this concept is unique to Brachos Krishma, since both the Brachos of Krishma Shel Shacharis and Brachos Krishma Shel Aris both contain both aspects of day and night. Therefore, they can be applied to both to day and to night. However, regarding our inquiry, regarding our shaila, our suffix, regarding wine and beer, this reasoning cannot apply, and we're still left with a question of a case where one begins erroneously thinking that he's holding beer, and he's holding wine, and he had an intention to conclude with a hagafen, which cannot be applied to a beer, but he actually concludes with a shakel. So we have a conflict between the opening part of the bracha and the concluding part of the bracha. The opening part of the bracha is considered to be a hagafen. The closing part of the bracha is indeed a shahakel. Which one do we follow? What is the true determinant of the bracha? Let's go on. Says the Gemara, Tashma mi seifa. Let's take a look at the seifa, the ending of this brisa. Said the brisa, kloli shel davar. What is the general rule regarding conflicts between openings and closing of brachas? It all follows the conclusion. Klol shel davar l'suyimai. What exactly is the brisa coming to conclude by stating this general rule that one always follows the conclusion? L'suyimai. What are we including? Lav l'suyihadamarn. Is it not meant to include also our case, where one erroneously began his birchas hanenen, his bracha over food and drink with the wrong intention, and concluded properly, that we follow the conclusion and the aforementioned case, where he began with the hagafan but ends with the shahakel. Since it was beer, and the shahakel is appropriate for the sheikha, for the beer, he has indeed fulfilled his obligation. Says the Gemara, no, la suye, the brisa is coming to include a entirely different case, as follows. Nama v'tamri, a confusion between bread and dates. Says the Gemara, what exactly is this story here? Hey Chidami, what are we speaking of? This man truly ate bread, which requires to bench Hazanas Olam Kulei B'Tuvay. He thought in his mind that he merely ate dates which require a bracha achroina of ala eitz v'alpureitz. Now he sat down to make a bracha achroina, and upasach adaita tamri. He erroneously begins making a bracha ata Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam with the intention to make ala eitz on the dates which he thought he ate. But then he realized his mistake of Hasiyim b'denahama. He concluded, he carried out with Hazanas Olam Kuloi, which is a nusach for Brichas Hamazon meant for bread. And in this case, the Brachos says that we follow the Chasima. Again, the Kloli Shadavar, the general rule which the Brachos states, was referring to this case where one confused his eating bread with his eating dates. He began his Bracha Achroina with the intention to say ala eitz, continued on with Hazanas Olam, and the Brachos teaches us, since the conclusion was done properly, that determines the nature of the bracha, and he has fulfilled his obligation of Birchas Hamazon. Says the Gemara, if that's the case that the Brachos is referring to, isn't this the exact mirror case of our original Shaila? Hainu Bayan, this is exactly our case, where a person took food, and he begins with one intention, he concludes with the other, and the Brachos will teach us that one is meant to follow the Chasim of the conclusion. Says the Gemara, no, Leitzricha, it must be speaking about an entirely different case. An opposite case. This case of the bread and the dates in the reverse. Kegoy, for instance, the Achal Tamri, he actually ate dates. Because Savar Nahama Achal, he thought he ate bread. Upasach b'danahama, he begins Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam with the intention, with the kavana of saying Birchas Hamazon. However, then in the middle, as soon as he said melech haolam, he recognized his mistake, v'siyim b'datamri, and he concludes with ala eitz v'alpureitz. Says the Brachos, his yaitzi has fulfilled. Why is that? Why would this case be unique? Says the Gemara, da'afilu v'siyim b'danahama yotza. Even had he carried out his original intention, when he began to say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, he thought he was benching, he thought he had eaten bread, and he intended to continue with the full-fledged Birchas Hamazon, Hazanas Olam Kulei. Says the Gemara, you know why it works for dates? Since, even if he would have benched on dates, he would have said Hazanas Olam, that too can be applied as a Bracha Achroina for dates. My timer, why is that? The Tamr Nami, dates too, Mezin Zaini, they nourish, they satiate, and therefore the halacha is, if one benches and says Hazanas Olam, even on dates, instead of ala eitz v'alpureitz, he has indeed fulfilled his obligation for bracha achrona. So therefore, this case is different, because in this case, even though he began with the wrong kavanah, he began with Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam with the intention to bench, to say Hazanas Olam. But you know why it works for dates? Since even if he would have carried it out, he would continue and he would have actually said Hazanas Olam, he would have been yaitziv for the bracha achrona for dates. Therefore, in this case, he indeed was yaitziv. However, back to our question of the wine and the beer, we're still uncertain. Since he was holding a cup of beer, he began Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, the first part of the bracha, with the intention to make a hagafan which could not be applied to beer. Then he realizes his mistake and he concludes Shakol Niva Dvari. And there we have a question. We have a conflict between the opening portion of the bracha and the closing portion of the bracha. What do we follow? Which determines the nature of the bracha? So, in conclusion, we had 5 different cases mentioned in the Gemara regarding a conflict between the first part of the bracha and the second part of the bracha. In 4 of these cases, we had a conclusion, we had clarity what the halacha is, and the 5th one, we're still uncertain. What were the four cases mentioned in the Gemara? Firstly, regarding a cup of wine. A person was holding a cup of wine, he began thinking that it was beer, so he starts Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam with the intention to making a shahakol. The chasima, however, the conclusion was indeed a hagafen. Said the Gemara, that works. Why? Because shahakol, the initial intention of making a shahakol, even if he were to carry that out in actuality and made a shahakol, he could have been yotzer for the wine as well, since shakol niyah b'dvari is moitzi everything. So that's simple. Continues the Gemara, what about the Birchas HaShachar? In the morning, B'Shachris, if he began thinking that he's going to say the bracha of Mariv Aravim, but then realizes his mistake and concludes with Yetzer Oyer. Or, in the case of Mariv Arvis, of Krishna Shal Arvis, he begins with the intention of saying Yetzer Oyer erroneously, but then concludes properly with Mariv Aravim. In both these cases, he is Yetzer. Why? Because Well, we had two approaches in the Gemara, either because the chasima was done properly and the chasima is a full-fledged bracha, it has a very, very strong significance since it contains Shem Hashem, Baruch Ata Hashem. Therefore, we follow the conclusion, since it was done properly, he is Yaitse. That is according to Rab. According to Rabbi Yochanan, who does not consider a Baruch Ata Hashem to be considered a full-fledged bracha, therefore we had to have a different explanation, and that was that since we are always mentioning both characteristics of Yom and Laila in both sets of brachas, so the original intention was to actually mention the right mention. He was going to mention, even if he was going to say Amar V'Rabim, he was going to mention Yom, and in the reverse, even if he was going to say Yetzirah, he would have mentioned Laila. Therefore, it could be considered to be a proper bracha, regardless of when it was said. The fourth case of the Gemara was when he actually ate dates. He thought he ate bread, and he began with the bracha of bread. Says the Gemara, that too will be okay, since even if he would have carried that out, he would have benched on the dates, he would have been Yotzeh, since the dates are amazing, zayni, they nourish, they satiate. The only remaining question we have is regarding the case where one is holding a cup of wine, a cup of beer, which requires a shahakol. He begins his bracha with the intention to make a hagaf and concludes it with a shahakol. In this case, we have a suffix. And the question is, do we follow the opening portion of the bracha? Do we follow the closing portion of the bracha? Since this is not really a full-fledged chasima, it doesn't contain Hashem, doesn't contain Melech HaOlam. So now the question is, does this have a status? Does the latter part of the bracha have a status? Can it be considered to be a din of a chasima, of a conclusion, and we follow the chasima? Or they are merely two parts of the same bracha, and we are left hanging, not knowing which way to turn? Tosfos says that it's a suffix l'chumra, and one must repeat his bracha in order to drink the beer. Continues the Gemara, Omar Rabba Barchina Saba Mishmei Rav. Kol Shaloi Eloi Omar Emes V'Yatzev Shachris. One who has not recited the bracha of Emes Yatzev following Krishma, V'Emes V'Emuna Arvis, the bracha of Emes V'Emuna in the evening, Lo Yatze De Chayvasa, he has not fulfilled his obligation of reciting the Brachos Krishma properly. Shenemar, we have a source for these two different aspects of brachos. Lahagid ba'boiker chazdecha, in the morning, when things are clear, when Hashem's power is evident, then we relate His chesed, and that is the bracha of Emes V'Yatzev, which relates Hashem's miracles, which He has done for us. However, in the evenings, when it's dark, when Hashem is behester panim, there's an element of hiding there, then we have to discuss, we have to mention and munascha, how we trust, we believe, we have full faith in Hashem, that despite the darkness that surrounds us, Hashem will indeed deliver us from our enemies and perform miracles for us and bring us the Geula. Continues the Gemara of Amar Rabba Barchim Nosab Mishmei Rav. Hamaspal, one who davens Shemona Esrei, Shu Kareya Kareya V'Baruch. When he bows during the word Baruch. Ukshu Zoykev Zoykev Hashem. When he says Baruch, after he bows down, and then when he gets to Shem Hashem, he stands erect. Amar Shmuel, my time of the Rav. What is the source for this type of custom? Dechsiv Hashem Zoykev Kefufim. Hashem erects those who are bent down. This is a source that one is to straighten himself out when he mentions Hashem's name. Rabbi Yomi explains the meaning behind this, that a person is humble towards Hashem, a person bows to Hashem to submit himself, to connect himself to Hashem and request his needs. However, when he gets to the Shem Hashem, then he declares his utmost trust and faith in Hashem that He will deliver and give him, provide him with all his needs. Meisvei, says the Gemara, when a person, on account of Hashem's name, is humbled. It would seem from here that a person positions himself in a humble position of bowing down, even when he mentions Hashem's name. Says the Gemara, Miksiv Bishmi, during the mention of my name, you will look as you are humble. Mipnei Miksiv, on account of my name, meaning prior to mentioning my name, you bow, but during the Shem Hashem, you stand erect. Amar le Shmuel lechia bar Uyan Talmud Chacham Tov ve'emalach milsam alaysa. Let me tell you a very nice thing. The Amar Avuch, that your father has said, that Rav has said. Hachi Amar Avuch. This is what your father said. When one bows, Kareya b'Baruch, he bows during the word Baruch. Shu Zoykev V'Shem. When he says Hashem's name, he straightens himself out and he stands erect. Says the Gemara of Sheshas Kikara, when he would bow Kara Kechizra, he would bow once like a rod, bow down quickly like a rod, because zakif, but when he erected himself, he would do it slowly. Zakif kechivyo, first he would pick up his head, and then his body, it would be a gradual erection. Rashi explains as to demonstrate that the position of bowing is not a burden on him. It's not something which he wants to free himself of, and therefore he did it gradually. Continues the Gemara. The entire year, Adam mispalel, Hakel HaKadosh, Melech Oiz Daka Mishpat. One during Shemona Esrei, during the bracha of Hakel HaKadosh, Ata Kadosh, he concludes with Hakel HaKadosh. During the bracha of Hishiva Sheftenu, he concludes with Melech Oihev Tzedakah Mishpat. Chutz, except Masar Yomim Shem Ben Rosh Hashanah V'Yom Kippurim, during the Aseret Yimei Tshuva, a person alters the nusach of Shemona Esrei, then he's meant to proclaim Hashem's kingship over the world. That is the time of judgment, the time of din, Shemispalel, and therefore he inserts a little bit of a different nusach. HaMelech HaKadosh. During Ata Kadosh, he concludes with HaMelech HaKadosh, the king who is holy, sanctified. VeHaMelech HaMishpat. At the conclusion of Hashiva Sheftenu, he concludes with HaMelech HaMishpat, the king of judgment. And as the Rishonim explain, according to this shita, the first one, HaMelech HaKadosh, is ma'akev, is obligatory. If he doesn't do that, he must repeat Shemona Esrei. However, the second halacha of HaMelech HaMishpat is merely a preference, is a lichatchila. Rabbi Lezer Amar, afilu Amar Hakel HaKadosh yatsa. Even by saying Hakel HaKadosh and not HaMelech HaKadosh, he indeed is yaitse, although lichatchila is preferred to say HaMelech HaKadosh, but it is not me'akev b'di eved, it does not prevent him from being yaitse. Shenamar, as we find, that the term Hakel HaKadosh is connected with judgment as well. Vayikva Hashem tzvakos b'mishpat. Hashem was elevated during his judgment. Hakel HaKadosh nikdash b'tzedakah. The sanctified Hashem, God, was nikdash b'tzedakah through doing judgment and righteousness. Emasai vayikva Hashem tzvakos b'mishpat. When is this pasuk referring to when Hashem becomes elevated on account of his judgment? This is evidently referring to the days of judgment. Elu asar yomim shemer Rosh Hashanah vad Yom Kippurim. The pasuk is referring to that time period of judgment. Still in all, the pasuk concludes v'ka amar Hakel HaKadosh. So we see that the term Hakel HaKadosh is appropriate even for the Aseret Yimei Tshuva. So in conclusion, there's a machlekes between Rav and Rabbi Lezer. According to Rav, one must say HaMelech HaKadosh. Regarding Melech HaMishpat, that is a preference. According to Rabbi Lezer, preferably one should say HaMelech HaKadosh, but HaMelech HaMishpat is not even a lechatchila. One can choose between the two. He can say HaMelech HaMishpat as well as Melech Ois Tzedakah Mishpat. Continues the Gemara, my Havela, what was the conclusion on this matter? Amar Rav Yosef, Hakel HaKadosh, Melech Ois Tzedakah Mishpat. He seems to be following the opinion of Rabbi Lezer that one is merely required to say Hakel HaKadosh and Melech Ois Tzedakah Mishpat. Rava Amar HaMelech HaKadosh v'HaMelech HaMishpat. One is required to say HaMelech HaKadosh and HaMelech HaMishpat. And indeed, the Gemara concludes v'Chasek Rabba. That is how the halacha follows, and that indeed is our present day custom. Continues the Gemara of Amarava Brachina Saba B'Shmei Rav. Kol she'ef shaloi levakesh rachem al chaveri v'enu mevakesh. One who has the ability to beseech mercy on his friend's behalf, ve'edim mivakesh, and he does not do so, he does not lend his shoulder to his friend's misfortune, nikra choite, he's considered to be a sinner, shenemar, gam anoichi, me too, chalilali, it is far from me, mechatoil Hashem, from being a sinner to Hashem, mechadoil, on account of my refraining, lespal ba'atchem, my refraining from davening on your behalf, on Klal Yisrael's behalf. So we see that one who does so is considered to be a sinner. Amar Rava, im Talmud Chachamu, if the one that is experiencing the misfortune is a Talmud Chacham, in that case, one is required to expend much more effort, to invest much more in his tefillah, up until the point of tzarshiyech la'asma olav, to even fall ill on his behalf. My time, why is that so? Where do we find this concept? Ilema mishum dechsiv, is it because of the following pasuk? Ve'ein choyle mikem alai, ve'ein goyle is uzni. None of you are revealing my ear. None of you are falling ill on my behalf. This is shol, bemoaning the fact that nobody is investing enough effort on his benefit, for his benefit. Dilma, says the Gemara, Melech Shani, a king is different. He assumes a much greater status. There's no right from there to an ordinary Talmid Chacham. Says the Gemara El Mehacha from the following pasuk. Va'ani, this is David HaMelech speaking in reference to Doigen Achitofel having fallen ill. Bechaloisam, when they were sick, Livushi Sak, I donned a sackcloth. Inesi by Tzoim Nafshi, I afflicted myself. So we see that on account of a Talmid Chacham, Doigen Achitofel, Talmid Chachamim, I must invest so much effort and energy, I must afflict myself even to the point of becoming sick. The Chasam Sofer explains the reason for this is that All Jews are united, and one is required, one must feel the pain of his fellow Jew, one must take part in his tsar and daven on his behalf. A Talmid Chacham assumes an even greater role, since it is akin to the body of a person, where the head is a source of life, of energy, which he infuses throughout the whole guf, throughout the rest of the body. So too a Talmid Chacham is compared to the Roish of Klal Yisrael, who is the source of life of Klal Yisrael, who infuses Klal Yisrael with the Kedusha and the connection to Torah and mitzvahs, and therefore one is meant to even become sick on his behalf in order to benefit, so the Talmid Chacham should receive his Yeshua. Continues the Gemara. One who committed a sin and he feels embarrassed on account of that Avera, he receives an entire mechila and kapara, an atonement on all his Avera. Shenemar, as we find in the pasuk, speaking to Klal Yisrael, since you are embarrassed on account of your Averas, I will forgive all your Averas. These are the words of Hashem. Says the Gemara, that is not a proof to an individual. Dimmer tzibur shiny, perhaps Hashem, who is speaking to Klal Yisrael, a tzibur, a multitude is different, they have a different status, and an individual not necessarily will have the same halacha that if he feels shamed, he will receive atonement. So what do we find? A proof regarding individual as well, says the Gemara from the following pasuk. Shmuel responds to Shaul. This was talking about an incident where Shaul had fear of the upcoming war with the Plishtim. He turned to Hashem and Hashem ignored him, and ultimately he went to seek advice and counsel from the spirit of Shmuel, which is something which is forbidden, but he was desperate, and he turned to the spirit of Shmuel, who had already passed away. Shmuel responds to Shaul, Lo mehirgar stani, why have you made me angry and tremble? Lahalos oisi, to bring me up and to communicate with me in this fashion. It's because I'm in a great pain. The Plishtim are warring against me. Hashem I do not have that connection with Hashem. He has not responded to me. Whether it's through the Nevi'im, or through dreams. Therefore I am turning to you and calling to you to advise me, to instruct me, how I should proceed. Now we find that Shaul mentions Navi, he mentions Chalaim. He doesn't mention the Urim V'Tumim, which was a standard procedure that one would turn to the Urim V'Tumim for advice. Why didn't he mention it? It's because he did not have access to the Urim V'Tumim on account of his sins. He killed out all the Kehanim. He doesn't mention anything regarding the Urim V'Tumim. Why? Since Shaul HaMelech killed out the Kehanim, that was a story regarding David HaMelech, who escaped, who was running away, fleeing from Shaul. He ended up in the city of Noiv, where all the Kehanim were. It was inhabited by Kehanim, and they fed him and they supported him. And since they aided the enemy of the king, he went ahead and killed them. And therefore, on that account, he had no access anymore to Urim V'Tumim. So he was shamed. He felt embarrassed. Therefore, he didn't mention it. He knew that it was as a result of his Avera. So you see that he experienced shame, and we see in the subsequent psukim that it says that he received atonement. Where do we find that he received a kapara min Shemaya from Hashem Shenemar? Shmuel responds to him by saying, you and your children tomorrow will accompany me, will come to me, imi, together with me. What does imi mean? Imi b'mechitzasi, in my enclosure, on a very high level in Gan Eden. So apparently he was forgiven for his Avera since he merited such a high level of Gan Eden. We have another source for this concept that Shaul received atonement. This is referring to an entirely different incident where they were experiencing famine, and they were trying to figure out what was the root, what was the cause of this sorrow, of this affliction, and they figured out that it was because of Shaul HaMelech killing out Noivei Kehanim, which had supported financially the Givonim. This was a group of people that were the woodchoppers and the water carriers for the Kehanim, and since the Kehanim were no more, therefore their livelihood, their parnasa was taken away from them, and on account of that, Klal Yisrael suffered the famine, and therefore when they tried to undo this injustice, it came to the Givonim, and they asked them, how could we atone for this injustice? And they told them, you need to hang the descendants of Shaul, Hakaram Hashem, to hang them for the benefit for Hashem's sake, B'giva Shaul, Bechir Hashem. And the pasuk concludes with the words Bechir Hashem. Shaul was a chosen one of Hashem. That is a very complimentary description. And the Gemara says this came from Hashem. Yotza Baskel v'Amar Bechir Hashem. That the Baskel called out those words. Bechir Hashem, he's desired by Hashem, he was chosen by Hashem. So we see from here that Shaul's sins were atoned for, and it must be on account of his being embarrassed, as we mentioned earlier. So we see from here a source to the concept that if one feels shame and embarrassed on account of his averos, he receives atonement. Continues the Gemara. Omar Vavo Bazutrus Amar Vuda Barzida. Bikshu, the Chachamim wished, they wanted to Ligboya Parshas Balach v'Kriyashma. They wanted to enact a custom that one must read the Parsha of Balak in the Torah, which discusses the Brachos, the blessing that Balak directed towards Klal Yisrael. They wanted to require one to read those Parshas, those Psukim, in conjunction with Kriya Shema. Why didn't they do that? Mishum Torach Tzibur, because of the additional burden placed on the congregation. It would make the Kriya Shema experience too long. Says the word, what was so special about those Psukim? What is contained in Parshas Balak that's so special? My time, Hashem who redeemed them, who took them out of Mitzrayim. If so, we find many other places that the Torah mentions Yetzias Mitzrayim. Parshas Ribis, Parshas Mishkolos, the Parsha speaking about interest, Parsha speaking about maintaining honest weights. And there too is contained mention of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Ella Amar Yosef Bar Avin Mishum Dechsivba Haikra, because in Parshas Balak is contained the following pasuk: Kara Shachav Ka'ari, the Yidden crouched down like a lion, Uchalavim Yikimenu, who can get him up like a cub. So it's referring to the experience of lying down, of going to sleep, and of arising in the morning, which is similar to the concept of Kriya Shema of Shachva Kamecha. That Hashem washes us, He guards us when we go to sleep and we wake up, and therefore it's very appropriate to read it in conjunction with Kriya Shema, which is said to, at least Krishna Shalaris is said to earn Hashem's Shmira, Hashem's watching us. Continues the Gemara, why then do we not just pick out this specific pasuk, and no more, why do we have to read the whole parsha and create a burden on the tzibur? Simple solution, let's just say this pasuk of Kara Shachav Ka'ari. Says the Gemara, Gemiri, we know halacha, called parsha the paske Moshe Rabbeinu paskinan. Any parsha which Moshe Rabbeinu divides in the Torah, we too may divide. But the le paske Moshe Rabbeinu le paskinan. We cannot divide a parsha on our own, and since it is one big parsha, Parshas Balak, we can't just simply pull out a pasuk. We would have to recite the whole thing, and that would place too big a burden on the tzibur. Says the Gemara, Parshas Tzitzis Bnei Makavur. Why did the Chachamim enact that one should read Parshas Tzitzis with Kriya Shema? What is so special of Parshas Tzitzis, which is the third parsha of Parshas Vayomer? Says the Gemara, because it contains many special things. Aside, in addition to mentioning Yetzias Mitzrayim, it has another 5 things. Number 1, mitzvah tzitzis. It mentions the mitzvah of tzitzis. Yetzias Mitzrayim, oil mitzvahs, acceptance upon ourselves of the yoke of mitzvahs. V'das minim. It comes to warn us against the views of the heretics. Hira Avera, it warns us against having impure thoughts. Hira Avodah Zarah, having thoughts of Avodah Zarah. Says the Gemara, Bishleima Hanit Las Mefarshan. The first 3 we see very clearly. Oil mitzvahs, t'chsiv v'risam oisay, zachartem es kol mitzvahs Hashem. You will remember all the mitzvahs, v'asisam oisam. You will commit yourself to do mitzvahs Hashem. Tzitzis as well. T'chsiv v'oslam tzitzis, very clear. Yetzias Mitzrayim, t'chsiv asher tzeitzi eschem. So those 3 things we see clearly mentioned in Parshas Tzitzis. However, the other ones, eladas minim, hiravera, v'Avodah Zarah, concerning the opinions, the views of the heretics, impure thoughts of Avodah Zarah, what do we find those things mentioned in Parshas Tzitzis? The Sanya says, the Brisa, achir levavchem, and the Apostle says you should not stray, achir levavchem, after your hearts. It's referring to the improper views that are contained in your hearts, uminus. That is the views of the heretics, v'chenu eimer, amar laval b'libay, the degraded one, the naval, the min, who degrades the psukim of Hashem, who misconstrues, misinterprets the verses of the Torah. He says, Ein Elohikim, he rebels against Hashem. So we see that the term leiv is referring to the heretic who misconstrues and misinterprets the psukim according to his views. So achir levavchem is minus. The Torah is warning us to keep away from the heretics. The Torah is warning us to not to stray after our eyes. Zohir Avera is referring to impure thoughts. Shnamar, we find a reference to eyes regarding impure thoughts. Vayam Shimshon al Aviv. I want to marry her. She finds favor in my eyes. So you see the term eyes in reference to impure thoughts. Says the Gemara, Atem Zoinim, the pasuk says, don't follow your hearts and eyes which you stray after. Zahir Avodah Zarah, it's referring to impure thoughts of Avodah Zarah. V'chenu Omer Vayiznu, you'll stray after Baalim, which is referring to Avodah Zarah. So mitzvah tzitzis is unique in the fact that it contains many different elements of importance. Number one, Yetzias Mitzrayim, and on top of that, another 5 things, which was mitzvah tzitzis, which was oil mitzvahs, which was warning us to keep away from, to guard ourselves against hira avodah zarah, hira avera, and hira minus. Continues the Mishnah. Maskirin Yetzias Mitzrayim Baleilis. One is obligated to recite the parsha of tzitzis, which is the third portion of Krishma, even during the evenings. Although tzitzis is not obligatory at night, nevertheless he recites this parsha since it mentions Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is obligatory to be mentioned even during the evenings. Amar Reb Lezer ben Azariah. Harei kiven shivim shana. I'm like a 70-year-old man. Nevertheless, lo zachisi. I did not prevail upon my colleagues to convince them regarding Sheti Omer Yetzias Mitzrayim Baleilos, that one is required to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim even during the evenings, ad until Shadrash ben Zoyma elucidated it from the following pasuk. Shenemar leman tizkar as Yom Tzeischa me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yimechayecha. We make mention of Yetzias Mitzrayim all the days of our life. What is koil? The word koil coming to include? Said Ben Zoyma. Yimechayecha is coming to say hayamim. During daytime you mention Yetzias Mitzrayim. Koil, that's coming to include halelos. Yimechayecha is referring to nowadays during the time of Golus. We mention Yetzias Mitzrayim. Kol yimechayecha lahavi yimais HaMashiach. That's coming to include the days of Mashiach. Although there will be many miracles which will surpass the miracles of Yetzias Mitzrayim, nevertheless we will still mention the nays of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So in conclusion, according to Reb Lezer ben Azariah, one is obligated to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim even during the evenings. According to Chachamim, that is not the case. Says the Gemara, Tanya, Amar lahem ben Zoyma l'Chachamim. Ben Zoyma responds to the Chachamim, how could you say that we will mention Yetzias Mitzrayim even during the days of Mashiach? The pasuk seems to indicate otherwise. The pasuk says, there will come days, nobody will anymore mention in the life of Hashem, Asher Helos Bnei Yisrael Be'etz Mitzrayim, who redeemed us, who took us out of Mitzrayim, Ki'im, but rather Ki'im Chai Hashem, Asher Helav, Asher Hivi Ezer Be'etz Yisrael, that Hashem who gathered together the Yidden, may Eretz from the northern lands, and Mekol HaRosetz Asher Dachtem Sham, from all the lands which they were dispersed there. So we see from here that the miracles which will take place during Mashiach's time will be greater and will surpass the miracles of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and therefore no mention will be made anymore regarding Yetzias Mitzrayim. Amr Lois, the Chacham responded, no, Loisha to Aker, Yetzias Mitzrayim im Koima, is not to say that the miracle of Yetzias Mitzrayim will be completely forgotten and eradicated from its place. Elasha Tehei Shibud Malchus Ikar, the praise that we will praise Hashem on account of the miracles that He performed to redeem us from the Shibud Malchus, from the dominion of the various nations. That will be the time of Mashiach. That will be the Iker. That will be primary. Yetzias Mitzrayim, Tafaloi, mention regarding the Ness of Yetzias Mitzrayim will be secondary, but nevertheless, there will be mention of Yetzias Mitzrayim during the days of Mashiach, and therefore the pasuk which says Koil, that is including the days of Mashiach, but there is no obligation to recite Krishma, the Yetzias Mitzrayim during the evenings, only in the morning.